The rain came down in Charleston like God's own judgment, turning the cobblestones slick with mud and memory. It was the kind of rain that seeped into bones, into floorboards, into the very foundation of houses built on the backs of those who would never own them. The streets below transformed into rivers of brown water that carried refuse and rot, the detritus of a city built on cotton and human suffering. The palmetto trees bent under the weight of water, their fronds drooping like penitents in prayer, and the Spanish moss hung heavy and grey, dripping with a moisture that never seemed to dry, that clung to everything like guilt. Margaret Thornhill stood at the window of the third floor of the Beaumont mansion, her fingers raw from threading needle after needle through silk that cost more than her life was worth, more than the sum total of everything she had ever owned or would own, more than the accumulated value of 15 years of her existence. The fabric was imported from Paris, shipped across an ocean by men who had never worked a day like she worked every day, handled by merchants who measured their wealth in thousands, while she measured hers in the hours until she could sleep. It was a deep burgundy that reminded her of blood when the light caught it wrong, of the blood that had built this city, that had purchased this house, that flowed through the veins of people who believed their humanity was more valuable than hers simply because they had been born in the right bed to the right parents. The fabric was imported from Paris, a deep burgundy that reminded her of blood when the light caught it wrong. She had been sewing for 16 hours straight, her eyes burning with a dryness that no amount of blinking could relieve, a sensation like sand beneath her eyelids, like tiny shards of glass scraping across her corneas with each movement. Her spine curved like a question mark that would never be answered, vertebrae compressed from years of hunching over her work. Muscles in her back knotted into permanent spasms that woke her at night with their insistence, their refusal to let her forget even in sleep that her body was destroying itself in service to people who would not remember her name. Her neck ached with a deep, bone-level pain that radiated down into her shoulders, into her arms, into her fingers that moved with mechanical precision despite the agony. The Beaumont family was hosting a ball in 3 days, and Mrs. Beaumont demanded new curtains for every window in the east wing, 16 windows in total, each requiring 12 yards of fabric, each yard requiring hundreds of stitches, each stitch requiring a precision that could not falter. That must be perfect because anything less than perfect was unacceptable, was evidence of laziness, was proof that servants could not be trusted to do anything right. The curtains had to be burgundy to match the new furniture, had to be lined with cream silk to filter the light properly, had to be hemmed with gold thread that caught the candlelight and spoke of wealth, of taste, of the kind of refined sensibility that only the truly cultured could appreciate. They had to be curtains that would make the other plantation wives sick with envy, that would demonstrate the Beaumont family's superiority, their place at the pinnacle of Charleston society. Margaret was 32 years old, though she looked 50, her face a map of suffering etched in premature lines, in the deep grooves around her mouth that spoke of years of pressing her lips together to keep from speaking, from screaming, from saying the things that would get her beaten or worse. Her hair, once the color of autumn wheat, had gone grey at the temples, was going grey throughout, strands of silver threading through the gold like frost creeping across a field. Her hands, once delicate and skilled, the hands of a girl who had dreamed of opening her own shop someday, of creating beautiful things for people who would appreciate them, were now twisted things, knuckles swollen from years of repetitive motion, joints inflamed and aching, fingers that locked into position sometimes and had to be massaged back to flexibility. The fingertips were scarred from 10,000 needle pricks, calloused and tough as leather, nerves damaged so that she could barely feel the needle anymore, which was both a blessing and a curse because she could not tell when she was injuring herself until she saw the blood. Her eyes, once bright green, had faded to a watery hazel, the color leached out by exhaustion, by the strain of working by candlelight and lamplight, by squinting at tiny stitches until her vision blurred and doubled. She had come to Charleston 15 years ago as an indentured servant from Ireland, fleeing the potato famine that had killed her parents and 3 younger siblings, that had turned her homeland into a graveyard where the living envied the dead. She had been 17, pregnant with Catherine, married to Thomas for exactly 3 months when they boarded the ship in Cork, believing the promises of the labour broker who told them that 7 years of service would buy them land, a future, the American dream that glittered like gold in their imaginations. That promise had been renewed, renegotiated, and ultimately forgotten, like so many promises made to people whose lives mattered less than the cost of the fabric they worked with. The 7 years had become 14, then 15, with no end in sight. The contract extended every time she thought freedom was near. There was always some new debt, some charge for room and board, for the doctor who delivered Catherine, for the food they ate, for the clothes they wore, for the air they breathed, it seemed. The math never worked in her favor. The accounting always showed that she owed more than she had earned, that her labor was worth less than the cost of keeping her alive. And when she questioned it, when she dared to ask about the original contract, she was reminded that she was fortunate to be there at all, that she could be on the streets, that her daughter could be taken away and bound out separately, that there were worse masters than the Beaumonts, though she could scarcely imagine how. The system was designed to keep her trapped, to extract every ounce of labor from her body until it gave out entirely, and then she would be discarded, replaced by another desperate immigrant who believed the same lies she had believed at 17. She understood now that the difference between her servitude and slavery was a legal fiction, a semantic game that let polite society pretend they were better than slave owners, while benefiting from the same exploitation, the same theft of human life and dignity. The Beaumont house sat on Trad Street, one of the most prestigious addresses in Charleston, a towering structure of white columns and black shutters that spoke of old money built on rice plantations and human cargo, on the broken backs of thousands of enslaved people whose labor had purchased every brick, every window, every piece of furniture. The house was 3 stories tall, not counting the attic where the heat collected like punishment, where servants slept on pallets barely thicker than the floorboards, where the temperature in summer reached levels that made breathing difficult and sleep impossible. The facade presented to the world was immaculate, perfect, a temple to refinement and civilization, but inside the walls told a different story. Inside, the house breathed with a life of its own, the wood expanding and contracting with changes in temperature and humidity, creating sounds that could be mistaken for footsteps, for voices, for the whispers of all those who had suffered within these walls. The floorboards creaked in patterns that Margaret had memorized, could read like a language, knew which boards to avoid when moving at night, which stairs groaned and which were silent. The house settled and shifted, its foundation built on landfill and marsh, on ground that was never meant to support such weight, such ambition, such concentrated human misery. It was full of whispers and secrets that Margaret had learned never to speak aloud, never to acknowledge, because knowledge was dangerous, because seeing too much could get you sent away or worse. She had seen things in her 15 years there, things that made her wonder if hell was not a place you went after death, but a place you lived in every day, watching evil dressed in silk and calling itself civilization, watching cruelty performed with refined manners and polite smiles. She had seen Mr. Beaumont beat a house slave nearly to death for breaking a crystal glass, one of a set imported from Venice, worth more than the slave would earn in a lifetime of labor. She had watched him use a riding crop, the same one he used on his horses, had counted the strikes, though she tried not to, had reached 43 before the man stopped moving, stopped making sounds, before Mr. Beaumont finally tired of the exercise and walked away, wiping sweat from his brow. She had seen the slave carried away, had heard he died 3 days later from his injuries, had watched his wife and children mourn in silence because even grief had to be controlled, had to be approved, had to fit within the bounds of what was acceptable. And then Mr. Beaumont sat down to dinner with his family, said grace with tears of gratitude in his eyes, thanked God for his many blessings, for his prosperous business, for his beautiful home, for his loving family, and ate his meal with appetite while speaking of plans for the harvest season. She had seen Mrs. Beaumont smile sweetly while ordering a young girl's children sold away to separate plantations. 3 children under the age of 7, split apart and sent to different buyers because the girl, who was perhaps 16, had the audacity to be prettier than her mistress, to catch Mr. Beaumont's eye in a way that Mrs. Beaumont noticed. The girl had begged, had offered anything, had promised anything, but Mrs. Beaumont had only smiled that sweet, patient smile and explained that it was for the best, that the children would be better off, that sometimes separation was necessary for the good of all concerned. Margaret had been there when the girl tried to throw herself down the stairs, had helped pull her back, had held her while she screamed and screamed until her voice gave out. The girl was sold too eventually, sent to a plantation in the back country where pretty didn't matter because no one cared what you looked like when you were cutting cane in 100-degree heat. Margaret had learned to keep her head down, her mouth shut and her needle moving, had learned that survival required becoming invisible, required erasing yourself until there was nothing left but the function you performed, the labor you provided. But something had broken inside her 6 months ago, a fracture so deep and so complete that she sometimes wondered if she had died and was now just a ghost moving through the motions of life, performing her function without inhabiting her body. It was not one large thing, but an accumulation of small cruelties, small humiliations, small deaths of the spirit that occurred so frequently they became routine, expected, the baseline of existence. It was the way Mrs. Beaumont would run her finger along a hem Margaret had spent 12 hours perfecting, would inspect it with eyes that looked for flaws, the way a hawk looks for movement in grass, and call it sloppy, substandard, evidence of declining skills and waning dedication. Never mind that the stitches were invisible, that the hem hung perfectly straight, that the work was flawless by any objective measure. Mrs. Beaumont needed to find fault, because finding fault was how she asserted power, how she reminded Margaret of her place, how she maintained the hierarchy that kept her on top and Margaret beneath. It was the way Mr. Beaumont looked through her as if she were made of glass, or worse, as if she were not there at all, as if she were a piece of furniture that happened to move and perform tasks, but was not human, not worthy of acknowledgement, not deserving of the basic courtesy of eye contact or a word of greeting. She could stand 2 feet away from him and he would not see her, would discuss her in third person as if she were not present, would make decisions about her life without consulting her because her opinions were irrelevant, her desires meaningless, her humanity invisible. It was the knowledge that her daughter, sweet little Catherine, who was 9 years old now, who still believed in goodness and fairness and the possibility of a better future, would inherit this same life of servitude unless Margaret did something, anything, to break the cycle, to interrupt the machinery that ground up people like them and converted their suffering into prosperity for people like the Beaumonts. Catherine worked in the kitchens, her small hands already scarred from hot pots and sharp knives, from burns and cuts that were considered inevitable, acceptable, the cost of learning a trade, though she was learning nothing but how to endure pain, how to accept suffering as normal. Her spirit was not yet broken, but bending like green wood under pressure, showing the first signs of permanent deformation. Margaret could see it happening, could watch her daughter's eyes lose their light a little more each day, could hear her laughter becoming rarer, her questions about the world becoming fewer, as she learned that curiosity was discouraged, that wondering why things were the way they were only led to punishment or disappointment. The girl was learning to be invisible the same way Margaret had learned, was developing the same hunched posture, the same habit of avoiding eye contact, the same reflexive flinch when addressed by anyone in authority. She was 9 years old and already learning to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible, to exist without being noticed. Margaret saw her future in her daughter's present, saw the long decades of servitude stretching ahead, saw Catherine at 32 looking 50, her hands twisted and scarred, her eyes faded, her spirit crushed under the weight of endless labor for people who would never care about her, would never see her as fully human. The thought was unbearable, was more painful than any physical injury Margaret had ever sustained, more devastating than the loss of her husband, more terrible than her own suffering, because at least her own suffering was finite, would end when her body finally gave out. But Catherine's suffering was just beginning, would continue long after Margaret was gone, would be passed down to Catherine's children if she ever had any, an inheritance of pain spanning generations. Margaret's husband Thomas had died 2 years ago, crushed under a wagon wheel while delivering supplies to one of the Beaumont properties outside the city, a plantation called Riverside, where they grew rice in fields that had been swamp until enslaved laborers drained them at great cost in lives and health, working in water up to their waists, fighting mosquitoes and disease, and the constant danger of drowning in the mud that sucked at their legs and tried to pull them under. Thomas had been driving a wagon loaded with seed and tools, had been hurrying because Mr. Beaumont wanted the delivery made before sunset, and the wheel had hit a rut in the road, the wagon had tilted, and Thomas had jumped down to try to stabilize it, and the whole thing had toppled onto him, crushing his chest, killing him instantly, though he had lived long enough to call Margaret's name according to the slave who had been with him, who had held his hand as he died, who had closed his eyes and said a prayer over him, though he knew he would be punished for the delay in bringing news. There had been no compensation, no acknowledgement of his death beyond Mrs. Beaumont, remarking that it was inconvenient timing, as they were short-staffed for the harvest season and would now have to find another driver, would have to go through the trouble of training someone new. She had not offered condolences, had not attended the burial, had not given Margaret time off to mourn beyond the afternoon of the funeral. Margaret had buried her husband in a pauper's grave, in an unmarked plot on the outskirts of the city, had stood alone beside the hole as they lowered the pine box, had not even been able to afford a marker to show where he lay. She had cried all the tears she had felt something inside her die along with Thomas, and then she had gone back to work the next day because there was no other choice, because in Charleston in 1840, people like her did not have the luxury of grief, did not have time to process loss, did not have the right to pause in their labor just because their hearts were broken. They had only the luxury of survival, and even that was not guaranteed, was contingent on their usefulness, on their ability to continue functioning regardless of their emotional state, regardless of their pain. The window where Margaret stood overlooked the garden, where magnolia trees bloomed white and fragrant, their beauty obscene in its indifference to suffering. Below, she could see the quarters where the enslaved people lived, ramshackle buildings that barely kept out the rain. She could hear singing sometimes at night, voices rising in spirituals that spoke of freedom in heaven, since freedom on earth was impossible. Those songs haunted her, made her think of her own cage, made her realize that her white skin had bought her nothing but a slightly larger cell in the same prison. She was not enslaved in the legal sense, But what difference did it make when her contract had been extended indefinitely, when she could not leave, could not seek other work, could not even walk down the street without permission? What was that, if not slavery by another name? The needle slipped and pierced her thumb, drawing blood that spread across the burgundy silk like a flower blooming. Margaret watched it with a strange fascination. The way the red darkened the fabric became part of it. She thought about all the blood that had been spilled to build houses like this one, to fill them with furniture and fabric and fine things. She thought about her own blood, how much of it had gone into these curtains, into every stitch she had ever sewn for people who would never know her name. The thought made something twist inside her chest, something that felt like rage but colder, more patient. She sucked the blood from her thumb and went back to sewing. But the seed had been planted, the first crack in the foundation of her sanity. That night, she lay in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, listening to Catherine breathing beside her. The girl talked in her sleep sometimes, nonsense words that Margaret strained to understand, hoping for some glimpse into her daughter's dreams. Did she dream of freedom? Did she dream of being something other than what she was? Margaret pulled her close, breathing in the smell of kitchen smoke and child sweat, memorizing the weight of her daughter's head on her shoulder. She thought about the curtains, about the way her blood had looked on the burgundy silk. She thought about patterns, about how fabric could be cut and sewn to create something new, something unexpected. Ideas began to form in her mind, dark ideas that she pushed away at first, but that kept returning like the tide, relentless and inevitable. The next morning brought no relief from the rain. The city was drowning, streets flooded, the harbour churning with angry waves. Margaret returned to her sewing room to find Mrs. Beaumont waiting for her, pale hands folded over her swollen belly. She was pregnant again, her 7th child, her face pinched with the constant nausea that plagued her. She looked at the curtains Margaret had completed, running her fingers over the seams with an expression of vague displeasure. "They'll do, I suppose," Mrs. Beaumont said, her voice thin and reedy, though I had hoped for something more refined. "The stitching here is uneven." Margaret looked at the spot Mrs. Beaumont indicated, saw stitches so perfect they were nearly invisible, and felt something inside her go very still and very quiet. She nodded, said nothing, waited for her mistress to leave. When she was alone again, she picked up her scissors, heavy things with bone handles worn smooth by years of use, and tested the weight of them in her hand. She thought about throats, about how soft they were, how easily cut. She thought about freedom, about what it might cost, about whether there were any prices too high to pay. The rain continued for 3 more days, turning the streets into rivers of mud and filth. Disease followed the flood, cholera and fever spreading through the poorer quarters like wildfire. The Beaumont family stayed inside, venturing out only to their covered carriage to attend church on Sunday. Margaret watched them from her window, watched them step over puddles, over the bodies of the poor who had drowned in the flood or died from sickness. Watched them maintain their careful distance from suffering, as if it were contagious. She watched, and she sewed, and she planned. The ball was cancelled due to the weather and the sickness, but Mrs. Beaumont still wanted her curtains hung. She wanted the house to be perfect for when society could gather again, wanted everything to be ready. Margaret hung the curtains in the east wing, standing on a ladder while Mrs. Beaumont directed her from below, telling her to adjust them higher, no lower, no to the left, no the right. The fabric whispered as it moved, a sound like secrets being told. Margaret thought about how much fabric it would take to wrap a body, how many stitches would be needed to bind it securely. She thought about patterns again, about the way things could be deconstructed and reconstructed into something new. That night she could not sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the rain hammer on the roof, listening to Catherine's breathing, listening to the house settle and creak around her. She thought about her life, about the years stretching ahead like a sentence with no end. She thought about Catherine's life, about the prison she was building for her daughter with every day of inaction. She thought about the Beaumont family, sleeping peacefully in their feather beds, dreaming their dreams of empire and cotton and endless prosperity built on other people's pain. And she made her decision. The next day was a Tuesday, bright and clear after the days of rain. The city steamed in the heat, the air thick with humidity and the smell of rot. Margaret went about her work as usual, mending a tear in one of Mr. Beaumont's shirts, hemming a dress for the eldest daughter. She was quiet, obedient, invisible. But inside, she was calculating, planning, measuring. She knew the house intimately after 15 years, knew every room, every closet, every hiding place. She knew where the family kept their laudanum, their sleeping draughts, the medicines that could bring rest or death depending on the dose. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck, which windows locked from the outside. Mrs. Beaumont had been taking laudanum for her pregnancy sickness, keeping a bottle in her bedside table. Margaret had seen it there when she brought up fresh linens, a brown glass bottle with a cork stopper. It would be easy to add extra to the evening tea, to make sure the family slept deeply. So easy. She pushed the thought away, but it returned, persistent as a heartbeat. By evening, she had stopped pushing it away. By nightfall, she had made peace with what she was going to do. She prepared the tea herself that night, something that was not unusual when the regular kitchen staff was ill or overwhelmed. She brought it to the family in the parlor, where they sat reading and playing cards, a portrait of domestic bliss. Mr. Beaumont took his without looking at her. Mrs. Beaumont sipped hers while complaining about the heat. The children drank theirs obediently, trained from birth to consume whatever was put in front of them. Margaret watched them drink and felt nothing. Not guilt, not horror, nothing but a strange calm that settled over her like a shroud. She waited 2 hours, long enough for the drugs to take full effect. The house grew quiet, the only sounds the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the distant barking of dogs. She checked each bedroom, found them all deeply asleep, breathing slow and steady. She went to her sewing room and gathered her supplies, scissors, needle, thread, measuring tape. She had miles of fabric stored there, bolts of silk and cotton and wool in every color. She chose carefully, selecting fabrics that would work for her purpose. Then she returned to the bedrooms and began her work. Mr. Beaumont was first. She stood over his bed for a long moment, looking at his face slack with sleep, seeing him for what he was, a man who had built his fortune on other people's suffering and called it progress. She thought about all the people he had owned, all the families he had separated, all the lives he had destroyed with the casual cruelty of someone who never questioned his right to do so. She picked up her scissors and pressed them to his throat, feeling his pulse beat against the cold metal. It would be so easy to cut, to watch the blood flow. But she had something else in mind, something more permanent. She began to wrap him in fabric, starting with his feet, winding the silk around and around like a burial shroud. She stitched as she went, her needle flying, her hands working with practiced efficiency. She wrapped his legs, his torso, his arms, binding him tight. She left his face for last, looking into it one final time before covering it with layers of deep burgundy silk. She stitched his mouth shut, his eyes shut, his entire identity shut away beneath the fabric. She sewed until he was nothing but a shape, a form beneath the cloth, no longer human, but just another object in the room. Mrs. Beaumont was next, and Margaret worked faster now, more confident. She wrapped her in pale blue silk, the colour of the curtains she had wanted for the nursery. She thought about the children Mrs. Beaumont had borne, about the future generations of oppressors she was creating. She wrapped her tight, stitching carefully, turning her into something beautiful and terrible, a monument to everything wrong with the world they lived in. The children came after, 4 of them ranging in age from 6 to 15. Margaret wrapped each one methodically, choosing different fabrics for each. Green for the eldest son, yellow for the eldest daughter, pink for the younger girl, white for the youngest boy. She worked through the night, her hands moving automatically, her mind somewhere far away. By dawn, she was finished. The Beaumont family lay in their beds, wrapped in silk and stitched into place, no longer people but sculptures, art pieces, statements. Margaret stood in the eldest son's room, looking at her work, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. She had created something new from something old, had transformed her oppressors into something that could not hurt anyone anymore. She thought about hanging them like curtains, about displaying them in the windows for all of Charleston to see. The thought made her laugh, a sound that echoed strangely in the quiet house. She went to wake Catherine, to tell her daughter what she had done, to explain that they were free now. But when she opened the door to their small room, she found it empty. Catherine's bed was neatly made, her few possessions gone. On the pillow was a note in the careful handwriting of a child still learning. Gone to Aunt Sarah's. Mrs. Beaumont said I could visit. Back in 3 days. Love, Catherine. Margaret stood holding the note, reading it over and over, her mind struggling to comprehend. Catherine had not been there. Catherine had not seen. Catherine was safe at the overseer's house 10 miles away, visiting Sarah, who worked there. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her knees weak. Her daughter was not part of this, would not be implicated, but that relief was quickly followed by a creeping horror as she realized what she had done, what she had really done. She looked down at her hands, saw them covered in thread and tiny spots of blood from where the needle had pricked her. She looked at the scissors still clutched in her right hand, saw the fabric clinging to the blades. She walked through the house as if in a dream, seeing it all with new eyes. In each bedroom, the wrapped forms lay silent and still, breathing shallowly beneath their fabric prisons. They were not dead. She had not killed them. She had only bound them, wrapped them, stitched them into place. The realization brought neither comfort nor horror, only a strange numbness. She went to the parlor and sat in Mrs. Beaumont's chair, the one no servant was ever allowed to touch, and waited for morning to come fully, for someone to discover what she had done. But no one came. The house staff was still recovering from the sickness that had swept through after the floods, and those who were well were occupied with other duties. The morning stretched into afternoon, the afternoon into evening. Margaret sat in the chair, not eating, not drinking, just sitting and thinking about freedom and what it cost. She thought about the Beaumont family wrapped in their silken prisons, still breathing, still alive, but unable to move, unable to speak, unable to oppress anyone ever again. She had not killed them because she was not a killer. She had only silenced them, had only taken away their power to hurt. That was not murder, that was justice, that was freedom. The madness had fully descended by then, a madness born of years of oppression and humiliation and rage that had nowhere to go. She began to think of her wrapped family members not as people, but as art, as a statement about the nature of power and servitude. She decided to display them, to show Charleston what she had created. She dragged Mr. Beaumont's form to the window, propping it up so it could be seen from the street. She arranged Mrs. Beaumont beside him, positioning her wrapped hands as if in prayer. She brought the children down one by one, arranging them in a tableau in the parlor, a family frozen in fabric and thread. By nightfall of the second day, she had transformed the entire first floor into a gallery of her work. The wrapped forms stood or lay in carefully composed positions, each one a statement, each one a piece of art. She hung some of the smaller children from the chandelier, like ornaments, their fabric-wrapped bodies twirling slowly in the breeze from the open windows. She positioned others at the dining table as if at a meal, their wrapped hands placed on plates that held nothing. She was creating a new world, a world where the powerful were silenced, where the oppressed could finally speak. On the third day, Sarah brought Catherine home. The overseer's wife had grown concerned when no one from the Beaumont house came to church or responded to messages. She and Catherine walked up to the front door, found it unlocked, and stepped inside. What they found there would become legend in Charleston, a story told in whispers for generations. The house of horrors where the mad seamstress had sewn her family into curtains, where the oppressed had become the oppressor in the most grotesque way imaginable. Sarah's screams brought the neighbors, brought the constables, brought the whole weight of Charleston society crashing down. They found Margaret sitting in the parlor among her creations, calmly stitching the hem of a dress. When they asked her what she had done, she looked up with clear, calm eyes and said, "I have set them free. I have set us all free." They unwrapped the Beaumont family to find them alive but barely, dehydrated and in shock, their minds broken by 3 days of sensory deprivation and paralysis. Mr. Beaumont would never speak again, could not bear to be touched by fabric of any kind. Mrs. Beaumont lost the baby and her sanity, spending the rest of her days in an asylum where she rocked back and forth, muttering about needles and thread. The children recovered physically but carried the scars forever, waking screaming from nightmares of suffocation and darkness. Margaret Thornhill was arrested and tried for attempted murder, assault, and a dozen other charges. The trial was a sensation, with newspapers from as far away as Boston covering the story of the mad seamstress of Charleston. But something strange happened during the trial. As details of Margaret's life emerged, as witnesses testified to the conditions of her servitude, as evidence mounted of the Beaumont family's cruelty, not just to Margaret, but to all those who served them, public opinion began to shift. Letters to the editor argued that Margaret had been driven mad by her circumstances, that her actions, while horrific, were the inevitable result of a system that treated human beings as property, as tools, as things to be used and discarded. The abolitionists seized on the case as evidence of slavery's corrupting influence, pointing out that Margaret herself had been enslaved in all but name, her indentured servitude nothing but slavery painted white. The defenders of slavery argued the opposite, that the case showed what happened when people forgot their place, when order broke down, when servants got ideas above their station. Charleston was divided, the case exposing the fault lines that would eventually tear the nation apart. Margaret was found guilty, but insane, sentenced to life in the Carolina Lunatic Asylum in Columbia. She was led away in chains, her head held high, her eyes seeing something no one else could see. In her mind, she had succeeded. She had broken the chains that bound her, had spoken truth to power in the only language power understood, violence. She had paid the price for her freedom, and she would pay it gladly for the rest of her life. Catherine was taken in by a Quaker family from Philadelphia, abolitionists who had attended the trial and been moved by the child's plight. They raised her far from Charleston, far from the memory of that house on Trad Street. She grew up free, educated, able to choose her own path. She never spoke of her mother, never acknowledged the story that followed her, but she wore only plain clothes all her life, nothing sewn, nothing fancy, nothing that reminded her of needles and thread and the price of freedom. The Beaumont house stood empty for years after the trial. No one would buy it. No one would even walk past it after dark. People claimed to see figures in the windows, wrapped forms that moved and swayed like curtains in a breeze. They claimed to hear the sound of scissors cutting cloth, of needles piercing fabric, of a woman humming as she sewed. The house became a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a reminder that there were prices too high to pay for civilization built on suffering. Eventually the house was torn down, the land sold and divided. But the story persisted, grew, transformed into legend. The seamstress of Charleston became a folk tale, a horror story told to frighten children, a parable about madness and revenge and the wages of cruelty. Some versions made Margaret a monster, a madwoman who killed in cold blood. Others made her a martyr, a victim who struck back at her oppressors the only way she knew how. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either version allowed. In the asylum, Margaret lived for 30 more years, sewing every day. They gave her fabric and thread to keep her calm, and she created beautiful things. Quilts and dresses and curtains that were sold to fund the asylum's operation. She never spoke of what she had done, never expressed remorse or regret. She sewed and hummed and smiled, lost in a world only she could see, a world where she was free and her daughter was safe and the powerful could never hurt anyone again. Visitors who came to gawk at the mad seamstress reported that she seemed happy, content, more at peace than most sane people they knew. Perhaps madness was a kind of freedom too, freedom from the unbearable weight of reality, from the knowledge that the world was broken and could not be fixed. Margaret Thornhill died in 1870, just before the end of Reconstruction, just before the promises of freedom were betrayed once again. She was buried in the asylum cemetery under a simple stone that bore no name, only a number. But her story lived on, passed from generation to generation, changing with each telling, but never dying. She became a symbol, though people could never agree what she symbolized: madness or justice, horror or heroism, the dangers of oppression or the dangers of resistance. The question that haunted Charleston, that haunted the South, that haunted the nation, was not whether what Margaret did was right or wrong. The question was what drove her to it, what broke her so completely that sewing her family into fabric seemed like the only rational response. The question was whether a society that created people like Margaret Thornhill, that crushed and oppressed and dehumanized until madness seemed like sanity, had any right to judge her actions. The question was whether freedom was possible in a world built on chains, whether liberation could come without violence, whether there was any path to justice that did not lead through horror. These questions were never answered, not in Charleston, not in Carolina, not in America. They hung in the air like the ghosts that people claimed to see in the windows of the demolished Beaumont house. They whispered in the rustle of curtains, in the sound of scissors cutting cloth, in the steady rhythm of a needle-piercing fabric. They asked themselves over and over, what is the price of freedom? Who gets to decide who is free and who is enslaved? When does survival become resistance? When does resistance become madness? When does madness become the only sane response to an insane world? The story of Margaret Thornhill, the seamstress who sewed her family into curtains, became part of Charleston's dark history, filed away with all the other stories the city would rather forget. The slave markets, the whipping posts, the separation of families, the generations of human beings treated as property. It became a story about how oppression breeds its own destruction, about how cruelty creates monsters, about how a society that refuses to grant freedom peacefully will eventually face those who take it by force. But it was also a story about a woman who broke, who could not bear one more day, one more hour, one more moment of her powerlessness. It was a story about how much a person can endure before something inside them snaps, before the weight of suffering becomes too heavy to carry. It was a story about what happens when you push someone past the limits of human endurance, when you forget that even the most powerless person has agency, even if that agency manifests as madness and violence. The historians would later argue about the details, about whether Margaret really wrapped her employers in fabric or whether the story had been exaggerated over time. They would point out inconsistencies in the court records, would question the reliability of witnesses who testified under oath to things that seemed impossible. But the people of Charleston knew the story was true in the ways that mattered most. They knew because they had seen the house, had felt the darkness that clung to it. They knew, because they understood, even if they could not admit it, that Margaret Thornhill was not an aberration, but an inevitability, the natural consequence of a system designed to break human spirits. And so the story persisted, told and retold, changing with each generation, but always carrying the same essential message, that freedom cannot be given, only taken, that oppression has costs that compound over time, that there is a breaking point in every human soul beyond which lies only madness or revolution or some terrible combination of the two. The story asked its listeners to consider what they would do in Margaret's position, whether they would have the courage to resist, or the wisdom to endure, or the strength to maintain their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. For Catherine, who lived to be 87 years old and died in Philadelphia surrounded by grandchildren who never knew where she came from, the story was a wound that never healed. She carried it with her every day, the knowledge of what her mother had done, the understanding that she herself had been spared only by accident of timing. She wondered sometimes if her mother had planned it that way, had sent her away deliberately so she would not be part of the horror. She wondered if the madness was really madness, or if it was the sanest thing Margaret could have done, the only way to break free from a trap that would never otherwise release her. In her old age, Catherine began to write down her memories, not for publication, but for herself, trying to understand the mother she had lost, trying to make sense of the senseless. She wrote about the small room they had shared, about the sound of her mother sewing late into the night, about the exhaustion that never left Margaret's eyes. She wrote about the love she felt from her mother, fierce and protective and desperate, the love of someone trying to save their child from drowning while drowning themselves. She wrote about the guilt she carried for not being there, for not stopping it, even though she knew she was a child and could have done nothing. And she wrote about freedom, about the price her mother paid for her to have it, about whether any freedom was worth that cost. The pages Catherine wrote were found after her death, locked in a trunk with her few possessions from Charleston, a needle, a spool of thread, and a piece of burgundy silk stained with what might have been blood or might have been something else. Her descendants debated what to do with them, whether to publish them or burn them or keep them secret. In the end, they donated them to a historical society, where they sit today in a climate-controlled archive, waiting for scholars brave enough to confront the questions they raise. The questions never go away. They echo through American history like a recurring nightmare, appearing in different forms, but always asking the same things. What is freedom? Who deserves it? What are we willing to do to get it? What are we willing to do to keep others from having it? The story of Margaret Thornhill forces us to confront these questions without the comfort of easy answers, without the luxury of judging from a safe distance. It asks us to imagine ourselves in that sewing room, fingers bleeding, mind breaking, daughter's future stretching ahead like a sentence of suffering. It asks what we would do, and the honest answer is that we do not know, cannot know, until we are tested in ways we hope we never will be. Charleston tried to forget the seamstress and her horrible art, tried to bury the story, along with all its other uncomfortable truths. But stories like that do not die. They seep into the ground like blood into fabric, becoming part of the foundation, part of the structure, part of what holds everything together even as it threatens to tear everything apart. The story became a whisper, a rumor, a legend, but it never disappeared. It lived in the careful way people treated their servants after the trial, in the reforms to indentured servitude laws that followed, in the small shifts in consciousness that accumulated over time into something larger. The abolitionist movement seized on Margaret's story as evidence of slavery's corrupting power, but they sanitized it, turned her into a symbol rather than a person. They made her suffering noble, her madness martyrdom, her violence heroism. But Margaret was none of those things. She was a woman who broke, who committed atrocious acts, who spent the rest of her life in an asylum, humming as she sewed. She was not a hero or a villain, but a human being pushed past the breaking point. And that was the most frightening thing of all, because it meant that any of us could be her, that given the right circumstances, the right combination of oppression and desperation and opportunity, we might all be capable of unspeakable things. The legacy of that night in Charleston rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. It influenced writers and artists, becoming a subject of paintings and poems and eventually films, each interpretation reflecting its own era's understanding of freedom and oppression. It became a case study in psychology textbooks, an example of how trauma and powerlessness can shatter the human mind. It became a ghost story told around campfires, the details embellished until Margaret was a supernatural creature rather than a broken woman. But beneath all the interpretations and appropriations, the core truth remained. A person was driven mad by cruelty, and in her madness she created something that forced everyone to confront what they would rather ignore. The Beaumont family, such as they survived, scattered after the trial. They could not remain in Charleston, could not bear the whispers and stares. Mr. Beaumont died within a year, his mind gone, his fortune spent on doctors who could not help him. Mrs. Beaumont lived longer, institutionalized, her pregnancy lost, her mind trapped in that moment of waking wrapped in silk, unable to move or breathe or scream. The children grew up damaged, carrying scars that no one could see, spreading their trauma to the next generation. One of the sons became an abolitionist, speaking at rallies about the evils of oppression, though he could never bring himself to mention his own role as victim. One of the daughters never spoke again, communicating only through written notes. The youngest child, the boy wrapped in white, died at 16, drowning in a river, though he knew how to swim. Some said it was suicide, that he had finally escaped the prison of his memories. The year 1840 gave way to 1841, and Charleston continued, the machinery of oppression grinding on as it always had, as if one woman's breakdown could not possibly challenge the foundations of society. But cracks were appearing, small fissures that would widen over time. The trial had exposed things people preferred to keep hidden, had forced conversations about servitude and slavery and the treatment of those without power. Northern newspapers picked up the story, using it as propaganda in the growing sectional divide. Southern newspapers defended the social order, but their defenses rang hollow when confronted with the specifics of Margaret's treatment. 20 years later, the nation would tear itself apart over these same questions, over freedom and slavery and the rights of human beings to own themselves. The Civil War would kill more Americans than any conflict before or since, would reshape the country, would finally end legal slavery even as it left the deeper questions unresolved. And in the stories soldiers told around campfires, in the nightmares that plagued them, the ghost of Margaret Thornhill would appear, her scissors glinting, her needle flashing, her voice whispering the same question over and over. What is the price of freedom? The truth is that Margaret's story had no ending, no resolution, no neat conclusion. It simply stopped, leaving questions hanging in the air like her fabric-wrapped victims. She lived and sewed and died, and the world moved on. But the wound she opened never fully healed. It remained there in the fabric of American history, a tear that could not be mended, a stain that could not be washed out. Every time someone asks about freedom, about justice, about the limits of endurance, Margaret's ghost appears, her hands moving in the eternal rhythm of the needle, her lips curved in that strange smile that could be madness or wisdom or both. She became a cautionary tale, but what exactly she was cautioning against depended on who was telling the story. Was she warning the oppressed not to resist, showing them the madness that lay at the end of that path? Or was she warning the oppressors that there were limits to how much suffering they could inflict before it came back to destroy them? Was she a victim who became a monster, or a hero who broke free the only way she could? The answer, like so many answers in American history, depended on where you stood, whose side you were on, whose humanity you chose to recognize. In the end, all that remains is the image of a woman in a sewing room, her fingers bleeding, her mind breaking, her hands moving with practiced precision as she creates something beautiful and terrible from the fabric of her oppression. She is sewing her freedom, one stitch at a time, and the fact that it looks like madness, that it results in horror, that it solves nothing and creates only more suffering, does not change the fundamental truth. She was trying to be free. She was trying to save her daughter. She was trying to make them see, to make them understand, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on her for 15 years. And perhaps that is the real lesson of the Seamstress of Charleston, the message that still resonates nearly 2 centuries later. That freedom cannot be given, that it must be taken, that the price is always higher than anyone wants to pay, and that sometimes the only way to be heard is to do something so terrible that no one can look away. It is a dark lesson, an uncomfortable truth, a mirror held up to a society that prefers to look away from its own ugliness. But it is Margaret Thornhill's legacy, stitched into the fabric of history as permanently as she stitched her oppressors into their silken shrouds, and it will remain there, disturbing and undeniable, until we finally answer the question she asked with her needle and thread. What is freedom worth? Who deserves it? And what happens when you deny it for too long?